Welcome to the CircuitPython Show. I'm your host, Paul Cutler. This episode I'm joined by Guy Dupont. Guy is a software developer, audio engineer, artist, and seltzer aficionado. Guy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Glad to have you. Wanted to ask you about your Subaru backup camera project that you released a couple months ago. I watched the YouTube video and got such a kick out of that. How did that work?
Yeah, so that project's interesting because it actually dates back to before I got married. When was that? 2018, I think. And it was my first hardware project that I actually put any real work into. And yeah, it came from an actual need, right? If you haven't seen the video, my wife's Subaru has a third party backup alarm installed that when you get close to something when you're backing up, it beeps, the most annoying sound you've ever heard. Um, and there was one day where we were parallel parking somewhere in Boston where we live, and it was one of those situations where it took a lot of back and forth, and by the end of it we were just cracking up because the sound was so annoying. And she turned to me and she said, if you can do anything, because she knows I like to mess around with stuff around the house. At that point I was just kind of getting into hardware stuff. I do a lot of software stuff. And yeah, she was like, if you're gonna mess with anything, mess with this, like make this better. So um, yeah, so I replaced the sound, the beeping sound, with a recording of my own voice, making kind of like scared noises, like oh 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 oh. And as you get closer, I get louder and more annoying. So yeah, so that project has managed to survive however many years in the car. I just put out a video where I rebuilt it using some more modern parts, I guess. I don't know if 3 years makes that much of a difference, but um, yeah, more modern parts. I designed it a little better because I know what I'm doing a little more now. And I made it so that you can add custom sounds, which was really fun. And I got a lot of good suggestions from the internet as well.
Oh, I bet. Well, it
Yeah,
always helps with those kinds of projects when your partner encourages you to do it
yeah,
instead of like going against the grain and building stuff that just kind of annoys them.
yeah. I don't get that very often, and especially because if for folks who aren't familiar with my projects, again, they're all a little bit tongue in cheek. Like all of them have a little bit of a kind of silly edge to them, and so yeah, usually when I'm doing something, it's not the most practical thing. But that one has survived, and it's a good. My wife rolls her eyes, but it's fun when people get in the car and I get to show them, and it's fun.
Absolutely. What does the CircuitPython code in that project kind of look like?
Um, yeah, right. I forgot that I rewrote it in CircuitPython. That's why I redid it. So it's pretty simple. So basically, the way the sensor works is, or I don't even know what the sensor is. There's something someone installed in the car, and there's a little brain living somewhere, some little microcontroller, I'm assuming. And what it does is it just pulses a little buzzer. It used to be a little buzzer with 12 volts on and off when you're getting closer. So it's if you know PWM is, it's like a very slow PWM where it's just on off, and so what you hear is beep beep beep. And so what I did, I didn't even look at what the sensor is. I didn't take anything apart. All I did was snip off the wires going to the buzzer, and I have the 12 volts, like the lines going into an optocoupler. I think you could also probably use a transistor, but basically, I turned it into, instead of being used to generate a sound, it's used to toggle a switch virtually.
Okay.
So yeah, so the optocoupler is tied to a GPIO pin on I forget which one I used. I used like a Arduino Xiao, the little tiny boards. Um, and so really what the code is doing is just looking for the pin being pulsed by the 12 volts, which gets converted to 5 volts. And I measure the distance between those pulses just by using the clock. So I just say time.now and figure out when the pulses are. And since I know those pulses are a fixed space apart, they get closer, but they're always the same intervals. um, I can basically say, if I detect two pulses between this amount of time, I know I'm roughly this close, or the car is roughly this close to the thing it's backing in. And so I use that logic, and then I just send, I have a little MP3 player module also in there attached to a speaker. And I just say, anytime I detect a change in the perceived distance, I just send a new sound to the player. And it's a little tricky because I wanted the sounds to sound as continuous as possible. I don't want things like restarting. So if you dig into the code, it's a little trickier than that, but that's essentially what's going in. I'm just measuring the time between these pulses, knowing that they are, fixed within the car. The car only has a certain number of options, and then using the measured distance to trigger sounds.
Got it. Well, I'll make sure to include a link to those videos in the show notes as well for people who actually want to see how it works or see it on video.
Yeah, hopefully the code is legible. I'm not known for my Python skills, but does what it needs to do.
Well, that's okay. I'm very much a novice. If anyone ever looks at my GitHub profile, I'll be embarrassed as well.
Yeah.
Tell me about the custom MacroPad that you created that uses CircuitPython, where you recreated Nokia's T9 predictive text so you can type one-handed.
Right. So this project has changed a lot for me. Not necessarily in terms of my job or anything, but just how I think about hardware projects and the stuff that I put out. So I have it here, but I'm not going to hold it up because we're on a podcast, and I imagine only a certain percentage are going to get to see it. So, but yeah, so I've always been kind of fascinated with T9. I feel like my generation, like who came up, I'm 31, so we came up kind of the dawn of cell phones as a commodity, as a common thing, and the memories I have like strongly tied to the cell phones are like stealing my parents and playing Snake and sending messages to grandma or whoever was using phones then. But there's a thing I feel like with my friends and folks in my generation where like people have said like, yeah, smartphones are amazing, right? But like there's something about texting with T9. Like people are really nostalgic for T9. And if you don't know what T9 is, it's a very primitive predictive text algorithm. So on those old phones, you only had it's like 12 keys basically for the buttons. And so T9 let you type full words using only those 12 buttons. And so, yeah, so there's a certain nostalgia for it. And I think people genuinely felt like they could type faster than they can on a touchscreen. And I get that because it's tactile and, it was predictive text. It was pretty good. So, I was talking to folks about it. And I was like, oh, yeah, it'd be such an interesting thing to explore today, right? And I looked, and there are actually smartphone keyboards that you can download that are just the T9 algorithm baked in, and you can use that. But I thought it would be really interesting to make a hardware keyboard because, like, I associated this with these old tactile devices where I wanted T9 built in some way. And yeah, so it ended up being a pretty simple design. It's a very standard MacroPad design. It's just a key matrix with a bunch of diodes, and then I actually designed my MacroPad that I have available to support any dev board in the QT Py Zhao shape, including the ones with the RP2040 like mounted on the bottom. I actually have a cutout in the PCB.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, so I wanted it to be as flexible as possible. I want, because didn't know what I was going to be able to buy. So I tried to accommodate as many things as possible. But yeah, so I realized that with CircuitPython, I could pretty easily implement all the T9 logic on the actual microcontroller itself. So that means when you plug this keyboard into a computer, you could just type on it and it will act as a keyboard like any RP2040 CircuitPython keyboard. It'll act like a keyboard to the computer, but what it does is it replaces words as you type them with predicted versions of what you might want to be typing. And the way it does this is it actually injects backspace characters very quickly to make it seem like the words are being replaced wholesale. But actually what's happening is it's just like typing a bunch of letters and then very quickly typing a bunch of backspaces. The nice part about using CircuitPython is since I'm writing it in Python, I can develop it and test it on my local machine. And because it is it's a relatively simple algorithm, but it's still, it's a good chunk of code. So it was really nice to be able to iterate very quickly and get, feedback, knowing that things are working or not working before I even ran it on the microcontroller. And then, yeah, the fact that I can just drag the library file. So there's a file that backs all of the predicted words, right? I can just drag and drop that onto the keyboard and update that as I please. So that's been really, really nice. And to be honest, like, I felt confident enough in my ability to like coach people through editing this thing that I've started giving them away, selling them, and it's so I think that's a very profound thing that CircuitPython enables, right? Like, because I'm not a hardware developer. I've written a lot of software, not all of it embedded, and so I'm kind of new at this. But the fact that I have this system where I can put this in people's hands, give it to a friend, give it to a parent who's not a tech person, and if they have an issue or they want to change something, I can just send them a file that they can drag onto the board and it just magically is good to go. That's huge. That's huge, right? Like, if you think about the alternative, like if I had to push a firmware update, if I found a bug, like how do you get that to people? And there are ways, right? Like, we have real products that do that, but to know that I could coach anyone, like on an email, anyone to drag and dropping a file, um, especially when it's this thing that people are going to want to customize. That's so cool. That to me is actually, that's the most exciting part about CircuitPython, because to be honest, I don't really like writing in Python that much.
What do you prefer?
I work as and mostly with Kotlin and Java.
Okay.
So I've done a lot of Android applications. That's kind of been my primary gig for the past 8, almost 10 years. Um, and so, yeah, so and even in school, the first language I learned was Java. Android, we did all Java for a while, then picked up Kotlin. Kotlin is by far my favorite thing to write in. Um, I think a lot of Python folks would poke fun at the verbosity. Not as bad as Java, but I like my type system. I like my generics, my covariance, contravariance, all that stuff. I want more of it.
I think I know what you're talking about. I know I've been getting into typing more in my C Python code that I've been writing.
Yeah.
Hi, it's Paul. I'll get you back to the show in just a moment. Thanks for listening, and if you like what you're hearing, hit the subscribe button and leave a comment that you subscribed. For other ways to support the show, visit circuitpythonshow.com/support. Now, back to the show. One of the things that you did mention towards the end of that video is one of the other advantages that you thought CircuitPython offered over C was just development speed as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, like, one, just being able to write the code that run, like, I have, if you look at the repo for this project, the code is set up so that there are basically different board, there's directories for every system that it runs on. When I say system, I mean like Mac OS, Windows, but then specific boards like RP2040. I think I have a version that runs on the Xiao, but not very well. Um, so that's like a SAMD board. Yeah, so I have it all broken out. But the cool thing is, there's the core of that code, like probably 90% of that code is just a single file that's the same across all of them. And so, yeah, so the point is, the Python that I'm writing to run on my computer here is not very different from the Python that ends up getting run on the board. So that's one thing that makes it super fast, right? Like, I would much rather be iterating on my computer, and then when I know it's done, when I know it's tested, dropping it on the microcontroller and figuring out the whole other host of issues that come with the hardware. So that's one thing that's huge. The other thing is just like, Command S, like save, reboots. You don't have to compile, rebuild.
Right.
That's another huge, huge, huge speed boost. So
A lot of the projects that you've done have been related to music, and I can see a couple of guitars in the background. Do you play an instrument?
yes, I play a number of instruments. Not super well, I don't think, any of them. And yeah, it's funny. It's like folks have pointed out that a lot of my projects have some connection to music or audio, um, and like I don't think of myself as like the music project person, but like it's obviously true. Like there's no denying it, and I think that's just like because I care so much about it, and it's just been a huge part of my life my entire life. So I just naturally gravitate towards things like that. So yeah, I play the guitar. I play the guitar on a bass. So I have a bass. I can make noises with it, but respect to basses. Just because you can make noises on it doesn't mean you're a bassist. And actually, my primary instrument is the drums. So I've been playing that longest. I was in my high school jazz band, college pep band. So that's one that I actually have a little bit of real training on. And I do so. Another music connection is I work not so much anymore, but I spent a lot of time working as an audio engineer, and that's kind of how I work towards a lot of the projects I'm doing now too. Is I spend a lot of time recording. I spend a lot of time working with other people recording and producing music. A lot of time in studios playing with all that fun hardware. So that's something that I love doing and do it whenever I can still.
Very cool. One of my favorite projects that you did that is music related is you put a Raspberry Pi into what must almost be a 20-year-old iPod. What
Yes,
were some
yeah.
of the challenges with that project?
Yeah, that project had so many challenges. Um, really, it was a fun project, but it's one that I don't look back on as fondly as some of my others, which I love what I made. I think it's really cool, and I think that one has done exceptionally well in internet land. So I'm very grateful for that. But because it was so challenging, like I don't look back positively on that experience, and I have a hard time diving back into that project, which I know I should. But yeah, so like you said, I took a Raspberry Pi Zero and I put it inside a fourth generation iPod. So I basically gutted the iPod except for the click wheel. I really wanted to feel like I was still using a real click wheel. So that was challenge number one, was just kind of reverse engineering how the click wheel was talking to the actual iPod hardware, and make it talk to my hardware instead. And fortunately, someone, and I'm forgetting his name, I think it was Jason Gar, had already figured out the pinout of the click wheel. So it wasn't that bad, thankfully. And I used Pi GPIO I'm just using it to like bit bang the input. So yeah, so I'm using the original click wheel. I put a new color screen, one of the little composite ones from Adafruit in there. Um, and then, like a LiPo battery and a little charger board, also from Adafruit, I think. And yeah, so it's very cool. It looks great when it's on and working. It feels great, but yeah, just like getting things to fit in small spaces is not a trivial thing. And that was pretty early on in my hardware experience. So I've picked up a lot of tips and tricks since then for how not to break stuff. And I broke a lot of stuff making that project, and it lingers with me. That one's still pretty painful, but yeah. And again, like to tie back to the Python thing, there was another project where I was able to do a large bulk of the development on my local machine rather than trying to get it to run right away on the final hardware. And that was really the first like bigger Python project I picked up. Again, reluctantly, it's not my favorite, but it was so clear with the Raspberry Pi, and just I used tkinter tkinter. I always call it tkinter as a joke, but the Python UI framework for building the UI for that. Like those were just obviously the right choice given the constraints. And then there was a Spotify API library written in Python. So yeah, so again, I built it all on my machine and got it 90% of the way there before putting it onto the Raspberry Pi. I highly recommend folks do that whenever you can. Like you will be thankful.
So before we wrap up, I have a segment I call Turn the Tables. I too am a big music fan, and I've got a record player and a turntable here at the house, but I've been asking all the questions. Here's an opportunity for you to ask me a question.
Sure. Can I sneak in 2 quick ones?
Let's do it.
All right. One, if CircuitPython wasn't Python, if Python disappeared from the universe, what would you rather be writing your projects in?
Python's really the only language that I know. Now that I know enough Python, I can read other code, but it would probably be JavaScript. The first itch I scratched was building a web app for some friends of mine for a Major League Baseball pool. Almost it's similar to fantasy baseball, but different. So since I started down that web dev path, it would probably have been JavaScript.
Yeah. I hope nobody unsubscribes to your podcast for this very hot take, but see, I secretly wish it was JavaScript instead of Python. I would take JavaScript any day, but
sure,
that's an unpopular opinion. Don't get mad at Paul for my unpopular opinion. Hit me up on Twitter if you want to fight about it. Okay, sorry. Second question: What's the best set you've seen at First Avenue?
Oh wow, that is such a great question. I have been so lucky to live in Minneapolis all these years, and for those that don't know, First Avenue is where Prince recorded the Purple Rain concerts that you see in the movie. So it's kind of an iconic nightclub from that perspective. My favorite show actually is in 1994. I won tickets on a radio station called Rev 105. Rest in peace. And that DJ that I won them from is still on the air here in the Twin Cities on 89.3 The Current, which is a public radio station that plays alternative and indie music. But I won tickets to a Best New Band showcase. And I went and I saw some bands that I had never heard of. One was called Zuzu's Pedals, which turns out their lead singer was the wife of Paul Westerberg from The Replacements, which I found out years later. And I saw this little known band called Pleasure. And I shouldn't say they were little known because they were actually kind of well known because of a previous band. They blew me away. I had been going to shows for years, and I had never seen a band so tight. Each member knew they were a 3-piece. And I ended up moving to the East Coast a couple months later, and a friend of mine moved out about a year later, and I said, "Hey, whatever happened to Pleasure?" I'm like, I never really heard anything, and I really thought they'd make it big. And I was working at a Best Buy store at the time, and he goes out to the music CDs area, grabs a CD, and brings it back to me, and it was Semisonic, who's known for Closing Time.
Yep.
But this was their debut CD that he handed to me. I've seen some great shows there, but for a band that was just starting out, they were so tight, so put together, so polished that it still sticks out in my mind to this day.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's on my bucket list to catch a show out there. I have a number of Twin Cities friends, and Twin Cities live music friends specifically. So I think it'll happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah, we're really lucky between First Avenue and the Turf Club, which is for smaller bands that are coming through. It only seats about 400. We've got some great venues here in the Twin Cities. So if you're ever out, look me up.
Yeah, definitely.
Before we go, speaking of looking people up, if people want to look you up on the internet, where can they find you?
Yeah, so my YouTube channel is where I try to funnel everybody to, and that's just my name. My name is Guy Dupont. The spelling will be in the name of the show, I assume. And then I spend a little too much time on Twitter, and I literally have to use the internet to find my own Twitter username.
I'll link to it in the show notes. So make it easy
link to it in
folks.
The show notes. It's my name, but the U's are V's.
Got it.
Gavai de Dupont.
All right. Well, Guy, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you again for having me. It was a lovely chatting with you.
Thank you for listening to the CircuitPython Show, an independent podcast with the people in and around CircuitPython. For show notes, transcripts, and to support the show, visit CircuitPythonShow.com or follow the show on Twitter at CircuitPyShow. That's CircuitPy Show. I'm your host, Paul Cutler, and I'll be back next episode. Don't forget to hit subscribe and stay safe.